Welcome to Worth Your Time with your hosts from the nationally syndicated Bob and Tom Show, Kristi Lee, and the president and CEO of the Indianapolis Zoo, Dr. Rob Shumaker. Our mission to inform, entertain, and educate with guests from all aspects of life. We guarantee there isn't another podcast that features two hosts with such different backgrounds and discussions with remarkable people doing exceptional things. So let's get started. Here are your hosts, Kristi Lee and Dr. Rob Shumaker.
Kristi, good to be back. How are you?
Good to see you, Dr. Rob. How are you?
I am very well, and I'm extremely excited about the terrific guy that we're going to be talking to today.
Yes, me too.
I've known him since 2012, and he is just a phenomenal conservationist, phenomenal guy, incredible scientist, and just about one of the nicest guys that you'd ever want to meet. He is currently the Chief Scientist Emeritus at Polar Bears International. Used to be their chief scientist. He's had a tremendous career. I am so pleased to welcome Dr. Steve Amstrup to our podcast today. I know he is going to be worth your time.
Yes, definitely worth your time. Hello, Steve. How are you?
Hello, I'm good. And I'm glad we were able to make this connection with the new equipment. So
Absolutely. Fantastic.
Sound like you're in the room with us.
Sound terrific. And you look great.
Yeah.
We get to see you anyway.
Yes, we do get to see you. Unfortunately, I don't have the opportunity to say I've known him since 2012.
Well, so
I met him at the Prize.
I did. I met Steve when he received the Indianapolis Prize in 2012, the world's leading award for animal conservation. And he is unbelievably deserving of that award, which we'll get into a little bit later. But that's when I met him. And Steve knows this. I have a picture of him with my son and my daughter, which is one of my favorite pictures. And they're just, I don't know, they look like they're tiny little kids. And my son's now graduating college and my daughter's 18. So that was great that they have known Steve for all these years.
I'm going to interrupt you here because I met Steve and Virginia's lovely wife at the 2023 Indianapolis Prize.
Just last year.
Yes, I was their VIP escort.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah. And at that event, you came up and took him away for a photograph to redo that same picture all these years later.
I think your wife, Virginia, asked us to do that.
It was cute.
She wanted to have that. My son and daughter were there, and they were excited to do that. Probably worth mentioning when we talk about all the stuff with kids, Steve has, in addition to his incredible work as a scientist and conservationist, just inspires people like crazy whenever he meets them. Any audience he talks to, any age, just a tremendous guy. So Steve, I realized something thinking about our conversation today. You and Kristi and I have something in common that you might not predict, and it had to do with Marlin Perkins.
Oh.
Yes,
Wow.
We all grew up watching Wild Kingdom. It was quite an inspiration.
I would not be doing what I'm doing if it hadn't been for Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom.
I'm not a scientist, nor am I out in the bush like he was, but I was inspired broadcast-wise.
Yeah,
I always wanted to do a show like that. I never did, but man, that was such a great program. I was attached to the television whenever that was on.
Marlin Perkins gets a little bit of credit for your career, Steve?
Absolutely. From when we were kids, in the summertime, we were playing outside. In fact, all year round, really. We'd play out in the snow, too, in Minneapolis. But when Wild Kingdom came on, I remember my mom opening the door to the house, "Stephen, Wild Kingdom's about to come on." And I'd go running. And yeah, I definitely attribute a part of the path that I followed in life to Marlin Perkins and to that program. And interestingly, and one of the great honors early in my career was after having grown up watching Marlin Perkins, I got to meet him in 1977. Wow. We did a program on the impact of coal development on wildlife in eastern Wyoming. And he came out with us, and he was getting 7 years then, but he was still pretty vigorous and a really interesting guy to visit with in person, and incredibly knowledgeable, knowledge base that you couldn't get a sense of when watching him on TV, because he was usually introducing Jim Fowler or somebody else, or making a funny comment like, I'll wait here in the bushes while Jim wrestles the alligator.
Jim in danger all the time.
Yeah. But nonetheless, he was incredibly knowledgeable and was an inspiration for me. So it was a real honor to be able to work with him some years later.
Oh, that is fantastic. Steve, you mentioned your early career. Was that when you were with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, when you were working with black bears?
I did the black bear research for my master's degree at the University of Idaho. So that actually preceded the work that I did in Wyoming. It's a funny story. When I did my master's work on black bears, which actually did point out some things that we never knew about black bears, it was the first study that really learned a lot about black bear ecology from radio telemetry. And so that was my start in those early years, in the early 70s, using radio telemetry. But I went on from there to a job that didn't last very long at the Utah Division of Wildlife. And there I was supposed to continue my work with carnivores, studying mountain lions in the Henry Mountains.
Oh, wow.
But between the time that I accepted the job and the time that I moved, the funding source for that project fell through. And so they made me a regional game biologist, which is an exciting enough job in and of itself. But then I had an opportunity to join the Fish and Wildlife Service and go to Wyoming. And there I was going to study bobcats, trying to continue working with carnivores. But in those days, spotted fur prices were really high. And every bobcat that we caught ended up being caught and killed by a trapper. And so doing a study of bobcats at that time was just not very practical in that part of the country. And so I ended up studying pronghorn antelope and sharp-tailed grouse. So I took a diversion, but it broadened my ecological knowledge, my ecological base. So I can't complain about it.
What was the most fascinating thing you learned about black bears?
Black bears live over so much country that their ecology is quite different in different parts of the world. But one of the things that was really interesting where I lived, it was a mountainous region, and where I was doing my work, I documented a 2 times a year vertical migration. So the bears would come out of their dens, they would go down to the lower elevations at the edge of the forest, really, and feeding on grasses and wild onions and things like that were coming up in the meadows and such. And then they would follow those things up as the snow retreated up, and they would be right up to the tops of the mountains. And then when fruits started ripening, like huckleberries, and we had areas there where there were wild plums and other berries, that the bears would come down for the first of those, and then they would migrate back up. And that would leave them at the very tops, at the very ridges, the very tops of the ridges at the end of the season. And then when the snow came, they'd go into the dens near where they were last feeding. So that double migration thing was interesting. And I guess the other main thing was that we had tremendous overlap in the home ranges of the bears, which had not really been hypothesized before. And now it's been pretty well documented that especially the male bears overlap a lot with the females, but we had a lot of overlap in general. And so that was an interesting finding as well.
Oh, cool. Gosh, we hear more and more about black bears in areas where they haven't been recently, which I view as great progress and a great success. Is that how you see it, Steve? Is that a real trend?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And black bears and mountain lions, for that matter.
Oh, right.
Moving along river valleys where there's forested habitat that gives them a little bit of seclusion. And I agree that it's really a wonderful trend, because those animals are animals that they can coexist at some level with humans with proper management, but they haven't been allowed to in the past because they've always just been shot. And we hear a lot about how these animals need lots of wide open space, big country, but one of the most important things that they need is to not be shot on sight.
Yeah.
And that's really, and we've seen a real change in the sense of the public regarding carnivores in many parts of the world. And that right there in the Midwest, where these animals are moving back into formerly established habitat, is a good example of that people there are more accepting now than they were
for sure.
Say
But
30, 40, 50 years.
the average person who would encounter a black bear, what do you suggest? Because you're seeing, here's the way I ask this. We see on Instagram and on Facebook, all these social medias, these cute little videos of black bears in the swan boats or black bears on the trampoline or black bears in my hammock or in my hot tub.
Exactly.
And Josh, one of my coworkers, and I, we were like, we would get killed because we'd be like, oh, look at the cute little bear. But what would you suggest people do if they do encounter a bear like that?
Well, remember that most of the time encounters with all of these predators are pretty benign, and the animal is going to run. It's going to engage its flight response rather than its fight response. So that's one thing that we as humans have going for us, because we wouldn't want to fight them in any circumstances.
Right.
But the other thing is to pay attention to the common sense rules about not attracting them into our habitats and getting them accustomed to getting food or other rewards by being around us. And that will avoid most of the negative interactions that we tend to see with bears in particular. And then there are some rules about how do you behave if a bear actually attacks you. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of little slick songs or verses that people give about. But in the case of black bears, black bear attacks on humans are really unusual. They're unlikely to attack, like compared to grizzly bears, which will attack viciously to protect their cubs. Black bears are more likely to send their cubs up a tree, and they maybe go around in the bushes and make some noise, but they typically won't just attack you like a grizzly bear. But if a black bear does attack you, it's because it has marked you for food. Ooh. And so if a bear attacks you, you want to fight back, a black bear.
Okay.
And so that is the number of bear attacks by black bears is very small. But the number of attacks by black bears, the proportion of those attacks that are of a bear that has clearly identified you as food, that's a higher proportion than, say, grizzly bears.
That is a sobering phrase.
Yeah.
It's been marked. That gets your attention.
Huh? Yeah.
You've been marked.
Excuse me, bear, am I food or am I fun?
That is sobering. Steve, we love hearing about black bears. We love hearing about your great thoughts about coexisting with wildlife. But fair enough to say what you're really known for is the largest species of bear in the world, and that's polar bears. Fair enough. Fair generalization, right?
Yes.
I also think that polar bears, you're probably one of the very few people who've ever been around polar bears in the wild, right?
Oh.
Most of us, there's a good chance we'd see a black bear.
Yeah.
But a polar bear?
Yeah, I've seen black bears in the Smoky Mountains.
Right.
But you're right. Steve, you are the go-to guy for talking about polar bears, and we look forward to delving into that a little more. So now you've got several decades of polar bear experience, back starting in mid-70s?
In 1980 is when I first went up to Alaska to start my work on.
And why did you pick the polar bears?
It was partly picked for me, but so the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that I was working for at that time, they had been trying to get a research project going in Alaska for a number of years, beginning probably in the early 70s. And the management authority for polar bears had been switching back and forth between the state of Alaska and the U.S. federal government. And finally, I think it was in 1977 that the issues between the state and the feds were worked out. And it was clear that research on polar bears needed to be done by the federal government rather than the state government. And there was just an absence of people willing to go up there and take the project and get it going. It'd been going in fits and starts for a few years, but hadn't really accomplished much. And I was the only person at that time who worked for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service who had experience working with bears, any kind of bears.
Wow.
In this day, there's numerous people, excellent people working for the Fish and Wildlife Service that have been studying grizzly bears or black bears or polar bears. But now, or back then in the late 70s, it just wasn't common for people to have come into the service with a background on bears. And so the center director, the guy in charge of all of the research that we were doing in Alaska at that time, asked me if I'd be willing to go to Alaska. I was in Wyoming then. Would I be willing to go to Alaska and study polar bears? And I thought, let's see, giant white bears roaming around in an environment that looks like the moon. What could be more exciting and challenging than that? So I picked me. So, yeah.
That is, I never knew that about you, that basically you were the only guy who was interested in doing that at the time. That's incredible.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know that it'd be accurate to say I was the only guy interested, but the way that hiring works in the federal government, if there's an opening within the government especially for a new high-profile project like this, they would generally tend to turn to somebody they know.
Sure.
Yeah.
Who is already an employee,
Yep.
rather than recruiting another employee from outside. But
we can easily imagine how popular polar bears are. People are just insanely interested in polar bears. They're so iconic, so incredible. I've not seen polar bears in the wild, but I've seen them up close. So, Steve, I don't think most people realize when we say the largest bear anywhere, can you characterize that, give people a sense, because they are magnificent?
polar bears are indeed the largest of the bears. I should preface that or establish the caveat there that the largest of the brown bears that live on Kodiak Island in the Alaska Peninsula are probably equally as large as polar bears. But over their range, brown bears also have a round-the-world range. And those bears in that part of the world, in western Alaska and in the eastern, the Chukotka region of Russia, those are exceptional as brown bears go. And most of the rest of the places, brown bears are much smaller than polar bears. And if you look at the grizzly bears, for example, that occur on Alaska's North Slope, just south of the sea ice where the polar bears live, those are very small bears compared to, they're half the size of polar bears. And this is all based on the nutrition. So polar bears have a very nutritious food source, feeding on seals that they capture from the sea ice. And the salmon-fed bears of western Alaska and the Chukotka region, they also have an incredibly rich food source, which is anadromous fish that come up every year in huge numbers, and the bears can harvest them and gain incredible weight. And you're probably aware of the fat bear contest.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah. So that fat is largely put on because of that salmon source.
Steve, you got to explain the fat bear contest.
I know about it. We talk about it on the radio every year.
Bear contest.
Yes, the fat bear contest.
There's a Katmai. It is a Katmai, right? Yeah. So they have a contest every year for people on social media to log in and vote for which of the bears on the salmon streams is the fattest. and so they pick these bears that have been incredibly successful at catching salmon and probably other reasons why they've become so large. But these animals are definitely built for comfort and not for speed.
We're not going to fat shame the bears.
No.
Maybe we should call them fattest. Maybe weight challenge.
Built for comfort, not for speed. That is the second most memorable phrase I've learned today. I remember that.
Yes.
That's awesome. So now, some comparisons when you look at a polar bear, like the size of the head, the size of the paws?
Sure. Yeah, polar bears, a large adult male standing on all fours can be nearly 5 feet tall at the shoulder. So think about that. That's almost as tall as Kristi. And that's shoulder height. And then they can be 11 feet long. If you stretched them out, they can have a neck that's 50 inches in diameter. So giant neck. And they definitely have a mouth that you could put your head in if you desired, the old circus trick. But I wouldn't recommend that.
No.
And their feet are incredible. A big male will have feet the size of platters. And they make a huge footprint when they're walking around in the snow. They really are pretty impressive in terms of their size.
I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, one of the things that is really impressive is anytime you see a bear on the ground, they look bigger than they really are. Just because we got this sort of whoa kind of experience whenever we see a bear. And if you see a big male polar bear walking up on you on the ice, which I have seen many times, they look as big as a house. And you're just like, okay, we got to pay attention.
So how close have you gotten?
I've captured probably a couple thousand polar bears, darted them with a dart gun from a helicopter, and then when they go to sleep, go down on the ground and weigh them and measure them and mark them, put radio collars on them. But on numerous occasions, when we were down on the ice working on a bear that we had drugged, we'd have other bears walking up on us. And often that would be in the spring of the year when the bear we were working on was maybe an estrus female, that is a female that was in heat, breeding condition, and that attracts males. And so we had several occasions where we had big males walk up on us. And these guys, normally they would probably see us, get a whiff of us, and they would just move on. But when the female bear was there and the male could sense from the smell that she was in breeding condition, they would come right into us. And so we had to sometimes shoot a cracker shell into the air or shoot them with a rubber bullet or something like that to get them to pause for a minute so that we could back away. But we found that the trick was, and we were always supported when we were way out on the ice, we were always supported by helicopter. And polar bears do not like the sound of a helicopter's turbine engine. So when a bear came up on us like that, it maybe rattled everything for a while, but as soon as the helicopter pilot could get into the helicopter and restart the engine, then they would typically move away. And then what we would do is we would catch that male bear and dart it and make sure that it was asleep so it wasn't waking, it wasn't up and alert while the female was recovering from the drug. Sure. That was important also.
Yeah, you weren't food then. You were just a blocker. And I'll save
That's
the other
right.
bad you're about.
Yeah.
So, Steve, can you explain when you were sedating bears, what was the reason for that? What information were you collecting?
The work, we called it, just in our vernacular, capture and recapture. And so this was, I think, is still the sort of that has provided the gold standard of information about polar bears worldwide. And we weren't the only ones doing this. There are polar bear researchers doing similar things across Canada and in Svalbard, north of Norway. But the idea is that you go out into the polar bear's habitat when they're ranging around on the ice, you catch as many as you can, and tag them with marks that will allow you to identify them again, or identify them in the future if you catch them again. And so part of that is that by looking at the number of bears that you capture and then recapture, there are ways to estimate population size. So that was one of the big objectives. But perhaps even more importantly was when you had a bear in hand, we would get every piece of information we could. So we would get weight, we would get a whole variety of measurements. We pulled a little vestigial tooth that was disappearing from the standpoint of the evolutionary history of the polar bear, but still we could read the rings in that tooth, a microscopic cross-section. We could read the rings like reading the rings of a tree and know how old the bear was. And so then we had a really good bit of information about these individuals that if we caught them again, which we always hoped to, and many times we did, we could see how are they doing? What's their physical condition now compared to what it was last year or 2 years ago? If they had cubs then, do they have yearlings with them now? Or does it look like they've weaned their cubs or maybe they've lost their cubs? A whole variety of bits of information. We took blood samples, we took a skin and fat sample, we took a hair sample, and all of these things then went into a big database that could tell us what the status of the population was, how healthy were the individuals that represented the population. And then in 1981, I became the first person to successfully radio collar polar bears, so that in addition to that physical information, we could then get an understanding of the movements of these animals. And in the early years, it was really challenging because we would put a radio collar on a bear and then find out that we had to go to bigger and bigger airplanes to follow them around because they were so mobile. And nowadays we do radio telemetry by satellite. And so you can put a collar on and then you can monitor where the bear is at home from your computer. But we couldn't in those days. And one of the earliest findings was that the bears, not only are polar bears the largest of the non-aquatic predators, but they are the most mobile. Some of them had activity areas of 600,000 square kilometers. That's about the size of Montana.
Wow.
And so it's a huge area. And compared to, say, the great migrations of the wildebeest or the caribou, the porcupine caribou herd in Alaska, the movements of polar bears can dwarf those movements. Very large and also very mobile.
Now you're talking about that much space annually, not over a lifetime, right?
Oh, yeah, annually or over a period of a couple of years.
Amazing.
Yeah. And polar bears don't really have what I would call a home range, per se, that has really hard boundaries or a territory. Like terrestrial animals often will do territory marking, and certainly the terrestrial bears do that. But out on the sea ice, the habitat is moving all the time. So you can't practically mark your territory because the geolocation of where you made a mark isn't even going to be in the same place the next day or the next month or the next year. So what I found was that they had highly overlapping activity areas, but they were relatively faithful to the same general geographic area. So in one year, when the sea ice was really the best for hunting in a certain geographic location, that's where we would find the bears. Maybe that location was in a little bit different place the next year. And so this idea of these very large activity areas wasn't just in one year because of the seasonal variation up there. But if you look at multiple years, they would repeatedly use the same general geographic areas.
As someone who doesn't know much about polar bears, because I'm not in the field that you two are in, do they hibernate? Are they solitary animal? Do they have families like the elephants, and how long do they live generally?
How should I answer that? That was like 4 questions.
Well,
okay, so let's go backward. How long do they live? Mm-hmm. The oldest bear that we had in any of our studies was a female that I think died at 33 years of age. And the oldest males were probably at 25 or something like that. But I think the average lifespans of the bears are much shorter than that. So maybe commonly into the mid-20s to high 20s for females, and for males in the late teens and early 20s. And like many large mammals, polar bear males are competing from the time that they're cubs, and they're competing in preparation for mating. And so even though they start out approximately equal sex ratio from the time they're cubs, males get honed down because of that competition, and I think they're literally just wearing themselves out, so they don't last as long as females do. But they still are very long-lived animals, and they learn about their habitat, and they learn what's safe, they learn what's not safe. It's pretty interesting. I think part of the reason that they would come up on us when we were out working on the ice was because it was something novel to them, and they would explore. And if they got a sense it wasn't a good place to be, they would run off, but they at least learned a little bit about us in that time. Okay, so that was the longevity.
Structures next. Yeah, social structures next.
There you go. So, that's a fancy way of
saying.
Yeah. We got to have somebody in this conversation who's going to keep things straight.
Thanks, Rob.
Yeah, so polar bears are, like most bears, they're solitary for most of their life. And the only lasting groups of polar bears typically are females with young cubs. So cubs are born in the spring. They're born around the first of the year, and they come out of their dens in the spring. And then a female, if she's successful in bringing those cubs to the weaning stage, she will keep them with her for about 2 1/3 years. So if she's successful in bringing off her offspring and getting them into the next phase of the population cycle by weaning them, she can only breed every 3 years. So there is a lasting bond there that can be 3 years. And males and females during the breeding season may hang around together during the breeding cycle for a week or 10 days or something like that, but it's not nearly as lasting a bond. And like many large mammals, the males don't have much to do with the cubs after. Yeah, I see you nodding there, Kristi.
Yeah, Kristi was nodding, not me.
Yeah, it reminds me of a joke that I used to tell when I was describing that the radio collaring that we did. This is a diversion, Rod. You can get us back on track. Rob, you can get us back on track later. But so I was describing why it is that we could only put radio collars on female bears, and that's because male bears' necks are bigger than their heads. And and so I remember that when I first said that one time, somebody in the audience, a woman, popped up and said, "Yeah, that's just like humans."
All right.
Anyway.
I am going to try and steer us back on track.
Okay.
No, here's a thought. Steve, this is tremendous. I'm wondering if we can get you to circle back and we'll do a follow-up conversation with you on our next episode, because Kristi asked about hibernation, and I'd love it.
Oh, yes.
If we could get you to come back and talk about hibernation, because I know that you have at least one pretty remarkable story of sedating a bear that was hibernating. Can we get you to come back for a second episode and we'll start off talking about hibernation? Does that work?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
So you want to skip that for now then?
Yeah, let's hold that for now. Let's hold that.
Okay.
We'll come back for it. Hey, I did want to mention, if anybody listening, if you're interested in learning more about Dr. Stephen Amstrup, he has a phenomenal chapter called The Natural History of a Field Biologist. It's an autobiographical chapter in a book called Saving Endangered Species, Lessons in Wildlife Conservation from Indianapolis Prize winners. You can find it on Amazon under the title or under the editor's name, who is me. So you can find it under Shumaker. If you're looking under my name for the editor, you can find it under the title.
And Shumaker is spelled
with a U, S-H-U-M-A-K-E-R. And it is a phenomenal chapter, and I love the title, A Natural History of a Field Biologist. Steve Amstrup, we are looking forward to talking to you more on the next episode
of Worth Your Time.
You've been listening to Worth Your Time with Dr. Rob Shumaker and Kristi Lee. If you like what you hear, please give a review wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to tell your friends. Word of mouth is the best compliment. Thanks to our producers, Chris Spangle of Leaders and Legends, LLC. You can reach him at leadersandlegends.net. Also, thanks to Sophie Ritz. I'm Christopher Geisen. Thanks for joining us.